Hi there, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am doing yet another installment of the Freelancer Q&A that I do each week. This week, in an interesting bit of symmetry, I'm tackling a topic that I'll see if I can dig up the link from YouTube. I think it was the first video I ever did in this series, was something like my opinion, like, should you do a sole proprietorship or an LLC, or like, should you incorporate something like that? This is pretty similar, but the question is subtly different, I guess. It is, what are the pros and cons of a sole proprietorship versus an LLC for a freelancer? So it'd be kind of interesting. I mean, I haven't covered the topic in 2 or 3 years or however long I've been doing these. So you could go see if I have the same taste as myself or if I'm a hypocrite. But I think it's potentially worth revisiting too for more recent opinions that I have or information. It's a slightly different question. So I guess with that said, let's dive into it, or at least actually I'll dive into this. This is one of the ones I should caveat. So first of all, this is going to be pretty US specific. I do think that those of you watching in other countries, there's probably some parallels between these corporate structures depending on the company, or country. But my knowledge is pretty much exclusively limited to the US. So if you're in a European country or wherever you might be, I don't know for sure if this applies. The other piece of caveating that I'll do is, this is based on my personal experience. I have formed 4 or 5 different LLCs over the years. I have also at times in my life operated as a sole proprietor. So I have a ton of field experience with these concepts. And also these days with Hit Subscribe, we have like accountants and CPAs, people that do taxes, et cetera, that I'm regularly consulting with about concepts like this. And we also give a lot of business to both freelancers and sole proprietors. So I have plenty of field experience from every angle, but I am neither a lawyer nor a CPA. So I am giving this as field experience, kind of like, here's my take and here's what I would do, but please don't construe this as any kind of official advice. So anyway, with all that CYA out of the way, let me dive into this a little bit. I'll explain sole proprietorship first, and then kind of go into what I view as its pros and cons. And then I'll get into LLC and what that is and its pros and cons. So starting with sole proprietorship, this one's easy to explain because it's just what happens by default. Let's say that, I don't know, a friend of yours has written a white paper and they come to you and say, hey, I'll give you $50 if you proofread this. You proofread it and then say, all right, write me a check, and they do and hand it to you and you go deposit it. You, congratulations, have just transacted business as a freelance sole proprietor. There is really nothing necessary other than the exchange of money in a non-employed capacity. What I mean is your employer, if you work for Acme Inc. and you go and fill out I can't remember the name of the onboarding form anymore, like the I-9, and like you do all the paperwork and they send you a W-2 every year, that you are not a sole proprietor in that relationship. You are an employee of theirs. Sole proprietor applies to any non-employment business that you transact. So it is the default situation for doing any kind of work for hire. Now, what are the pros of this? The pros are really just how easy and default it is. So the pros don't make a lot of sense until I get into talking about what an LLC is and its pros and cons. But I would say the pro to being a sole proprietor is you don't do anything. You can just blunder your way into this with no knowledge of anything. So it's easy. And the other pro is there is no cost or logistical anything associated with it. That's really it. The rest of it is cons. So in terms of cons, being a sole proprietor and not bothering to form any kind of legal entity around what you're doing. Number one is personal liability. I will get into this more when I describe what a limited liability company, LLC, is. But there's a definite con, which is that you theoretically have personal liability when it comes to the business that you do. Although I'll caveat that a little by saying that the overwhelming majority of freelancers are judgment proof. I'll see if I can dig up the video where I've talked about contracts, why I don't care too much about those. So yes, in theory, as a freelancer, you have personal liability, and Megacorp that you're doing business with as a client could sue you. And in theory, put a lien on your house and repossess your car and all that type of stuff. The reality is it's pretty much never going to be worth suing you. They would incur more on the first day in legal fees than they would ever claw out of you. So, it's more of a theoretical pro, or a con for being a sole proprietor, is that you can be personally sued. A bigger and more pragmatic con to being a sole proprietor, I would say, is that you don't look as serious to clients. Now, rightly or wrongly, if you are a freelancer, and I should say, by the way, it is fairly easy for a client to tell whether you're a sole proprietor or LLC. Rightly or wrongly, they're likely to view you as a less serious, more pseudo employee-ish person if you do not have a corporate entity. So don't blame me for that one, but that is just kind of the reality. I have heard tell of maybe even being offered less money or negotiated with differently because you're a sole proprietor. There are things like that going on. So there are optics to consider. Another con to being a sole proprietor is that you are kind of foregoing the ability to act as a company in ways that I'll get more into in the LLC section. But like an easy one to think about is if you are acting as a sole proprietor, you don't have any way, like let's say that you eventually wanted to backfill yourself and just be the owner of a business, but not work in the business. That's nonsense as a sole proprietor. Like that just wouldn't be possible. So there are things, the con for sole proprietorship is there are things you might later want to do that involve scale that you simply cannot execute as a sole proprietor. So at whatever time you want to do these things, you would need to incorporate in some way anyway. So those are, I would say, the big cons. There's also some subtle tax disadvantages potentially to being a sole proprietor. Although I think there is a piece of advice out there that says like you're going to get tax breaks by forming an LLC. That isn't strictly true. Again, I'll get more into this in the next section about LLCs, but there is the potential to be slightly less. I don't even know how to put it, but you might be less likely to claim certain tax deductions if you do not form some kind of corporate entity. So kind of to recap here, the main pros of being a sole proprietor is just that it's easy and it's the path of least resistance. And that's really the only pro that I can think of. If you go watch that old video, I believe I recommended, and I certainly recommend now, form an LLC. Just do it. If you're going to do businesses yourself, it's not that expensive, and it's good. Well, I'm getting into the pros of LLC here, but so the only pro really for this whole proprietorship is just that it's easy, and the cons are you do risk some personal liability in theory. You look less serious to clients, and there are potentially downstream tax advantages that you're going to forego. Okay, so LLC, let's talk through that a little bit. LLC means limited liability company or corporation. I'm not sure which, but it is a legal entity that you form. Now, one thing that's confusing here is that there are kind of two ways that governments regard you and your business in the US. There is the legal structure of the entity that you form, and limited liability company is a legal structure only. There is also the relationship that you have with the IRS, and that is it can be an S corporation kind of, or a C corporation. You can incorporate as an entity. So you can incorporate as an LLC, or you can incorporate as a partnership, C corp. These are legal structures, and then there's also how you file with the government, and that can be S corp election or C corp. Now, these things are kind of confusingly substituted for each other in both contexts. But the thing I want to make clear here when we're talking about an LLC is that an LLC, as far as the IRS is concerned, isn't really a thing. So an LLC is a legal entity that insulates you against lawsuits and so on. And it is a way to record a business with the state government. But if you are filing as an LLC with the IRS, that is viewed in the same way. It is a pass-through tax structure. So the IRS, if you form an LLC, views that as no different than if you had a sole proprietorship. And I know this is confusing, I'm sorry, but it's important as I get into the pros and cons to qualify what I was saying about tax advantages. So let's put that confusing thing aside for the moment and look at the pros of forming an LLC. Number one is you limit your liability. So however unlikely it is that a company is going to sue you, Susie Q Freelancer, it is possible. If you form an LLC, and assuming you don't do anything criminal, which would allow them to pierce the corporate veil, they can only sue you for what your LLC, what your business is worth. They cannot come after you personally. And that's definitely an advantage. Another advantage that you have is that you are going to look more serious to people that you do business with. So when you form an LLC, you also need to apply for an employer identification number with the IRS from a federal perspective. And that employer identification number becomes your business's social security number, for lack of a better way of putting it. So when you are filling out paperwork that your clients ask you to do, like a W-9, you will be filling in your employer identification number, and that lets them know that you are a business, not an individual. So you look more like a real business. Now, I talked a little bit about tax advantages, and that is kind of true. So if you set up an LLC versus a sole proprietorship, there is no monetary tax advantage precisely. The IRS views those two as the same thing. But in practice, if you're standing up an LLC, it is more likely that you're probably going to also go form business bank accounts. And in fact, I think in order to create a business bank account at most banks, you need that employer identification number that is going to be tied to your legal business entity. So what happens is if you incorporate, if you form an LLC, you're going to get an employer identification number. It is going to be easier and more assumed that you will go set up separate banking and do separate accounting for your business. A lot of sole proprietors will just, pay things out of their personal checking and take money into the personal checking. So given that the LLC structure funnels you more towards separate accounting and a separate structure, it's going to be easier for you to log business expenses, and it's going to be less questionable. And here's what I mean. If you go to all the effort to set up a separate business banking account and you are charging staples to that account, if in practice you are going to be audited by the IRS or something like that, you have a nice clean demarcation of what is and isn't a business expense. And it will be easier from a process perspective, and in terms of sending things to your accounting, it will be easier in every way for you to identify business expenses as things associated with your business and then claim deductions on them than if you have your own personal account as a sole proprietor and your CPA is like, well, did you really buy these staples for your business, or are these more like personal staples? So procedurally, there is nothing that differentiates an LLC versus a sole proprietorship. Those are both what are known as pass-through tax structures. But in terms of actually realistically claiming the business deductions, you are more likely to do that if you are an LLC, because everything about being an LLC encourages you to separate your business from your personal. Another advantage, so I had talked about like the survivability of the business and being able to do things like hiring and backfilling yourself and various other transactions, I guess, related to doing business. This is also another advantage. When you have an actual legal business entity, it can do way more things. So if later you want to start having payrolls and hiring subcontractors or hiring employees, if later you want to sell the business, you need a business entity to do those things. So if you, the freelancer, ever have any designs on scaling your business and starting to do increasingly sophisticated business things, you are going to need to form a corporate entity anyway. You might as well do it now. So those are all the advantages really there that I can think of. The other thing is, in terms of tax advantages, there is a way for a freelancer who files as an S corp to realize a tax advantage. So I'll briefly detour down this road, but if you file an LLC versus if you're a sole proprietor, in both of those situations, let's say that you earn $200,000 in revenue less expenses. So your profit is 200,000. That is your income, your realized personal income. In both of those situations, you will pay something that is colloquially known as self-employment tax. To understand what that means, when you are a salaried employee, there is this subset of tax called payroll taxes. When you are an employee, your employer actually pays taxes on your salary, and so do you, for some subset of the taxes that are levied against this relationship. So when you're working and you look at your employment income breakdown and you see that you're paying into federal tax and Social Security and disability and these various things, for some of those taxes, your employer is also paying. Now, when you go off on your own, you are both the employer employee. So suddenly you incur a higher tax than you're used to paying if you were a salaried employee. This portion, this extra tax that your employer used to take care of, is called self-employment tax. And it can be quite a bit of sticker shock if you are not familiar with this. I think it's 7.5%. Like, so suddenly your effective tax rate increases by 7.5%. This is true if you are filing just as an LLC, which is a non-entity, recall, as far as the IRS is concerned. As sole proprietorship LLC, either way, you're getting hit with self-employment tax. If you have an LLC, however, you can do what is known as the S Corp election. And that basically means that you are going to pay yourself some of your income as salary. And then the other part you are taking out of the business as what is known as a distribution. And basically, if you want to map that to something, think of it's like you own stock in your own business and you're paying yourself dividends. Now, if you own stock in Starbucks or whatever, and you receive dividends from Starbucks, you do pay income tax on that, but you do not pay Social Security and these payroll taxes. So in the end, if you have an LLC and you're getting really hosed because you're a high earner with self-employment tax, you can file this S Corp election and realize a tax deduction, like a material tax deduction that isn't just about careful filing. So a pro of the LLC is that you have the option to opt into more beneficial tax structures if you are so inclined. So that's kind of a run through the pros and cons. And I realize that some of this is wonky. And I haven't really gotten into describing what a C Corp is like and some other structures that you might form. But for a freelancer, especially if you've just started out, your options are really going to be forming an LLC or just operating as a sole proprietorship. I will say, as a piece of advice, well, not to be officially construed as advice, if it were me, I would not think about the S Corp election initially. That is, you are going to have to figure out how to run payrolls. It involves a whole other level of complexity that does not exist if you just file as, or if you just incorporate as an LLC. It is a headache, and I wouldn't really probably give it serious consideration until I would say you're around 150K in gross income. Before that, the amount of effort and money that you're going to have to spend on CPAs and running payrolls is probably going to actually be more than the savings on self-employment tax. So roughly 150K. If you're above that, then maybe you think about it. But as a freelancer starting out, it is LLC or sole proprietorship. For my money, it is a no-brainer. I mean, you're talking about tens, maybe hundreds of dollars a year to have the corporate entity. And it makes you look more professional. It's not really that hard to do once you do it. It's a pain. It can seem a little intimidating. It's not that hard. I'll see if I can dig up the videos when I live stream myself doing this, doing both the filing and the employer identification number. It really isn't that bad. I would strongly recommend doing the LLC. It insulates you against liability. It makes you look more professional. It sets you up to possibly have a tax advantage. But I'd say the most critical thing that it does for you is that it gives you all kinds of future optionality. If your business is ever going to take off or get more serious or scale in any way, you are going to need to do this anyway. So you might as well do it now. It gives you some real world experience. It makes you look more professional. You understand a little bit more about how, being in business for yourself works. So I just would 100% recommend forming the LLC for what it's worth. So hopefully that is somewhat informative or helpful, and I will catch you all next time.